I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. On this program, we feature leading newsmakers and the New York Times journalists who cover them. This week, true crime storytelling. It's gone viral. A New York Times Magazine writer looks into the impact the true crime community is now having on the victims it supposedly intends to help. But first, it's time for our first year-end wrap-up. This week, the best of 2023 in contemporary theater. It was a lively year of engaging audiences on new and diverse topics with humor and music. New York Times chief theater critic Jesse Green joins us to reveal his best in shows and the shining stars you may want to seek out this holiday season. Jesse, was there a thread, was there a theme that ran through the best shows this year?
Not quite all of them, but more than usual combined comedy and drama. So that in the pandemic years, we're still in the pandemic, I suppose, but in the worst of the pandemic years, well, there wasn't theater, but there was online theater. And then coming out of it, we had a lot of rather grim plays, as you might expect, which were possibly appropriate and useful for that moment. But what I noticed this year is that we're pulling into a new phase where the message is more about, yeah, we're going to deal with serious things, but we're going to take seriously the importance of entertaining the audience at the same time, whether that's through comedy or music or just incredible craftsmanship.
Is that because things have gotten so much worse in the world that we have to find something leavening, or is that just coincidental?
I think it's partly what you said, but I think it's partly also the mandate of theater throughout history. We just go through waves, like when you're swimming the ocean and you suddenly feel a cold drift underneath you. We go through times where where the messages are too important for the people who are writing plays, and they put those first, and maybe secondarily the part about entertaining and thrilling people. I'm not against that, but it was very nice to see us sort of emerging into a more mixed palette this year.
Does this happen coincidentally, or is there a writer's room where all the playwrights get together and say, this is what we need to do this year?
I send them a memo every September about the following year. Yeah, it's all me. No, I think it's both. I think it's both a coincidence because no one plans the season. The season just happens by what's developing in the regional theaters and the off-Broadway theaters. But I think also people are responding at a similar pace to changes in the world. And so X number of months or years after a certain thing happens, you're going to start seeing works that address it in one way or another. Is
Broadway bouncing back now from the pandemic?
Yes, although certainly not fully up to the levels of the pre-pandemic. I think my colleague Michael Paulson, who's the theater reporter, has told me that in terms of money, it's at about 80% of where it was, which is not where they need to be.
And who goes to theater these days?
Well, rich people go to theater a lot more than anyone else because they can afford to. And some of, now that congestion pricing, I call it, has come to the theater and not just the streets of Manhattan, it can get extremely expensive to see a hot show. So when we can discuss that, but people in the know also know how to get the really cheap tickets.
Are there really cheap tickets?
There really are. I mean, as at the Metropolitan Opera, if you just have to know how to do it and be willing to maybe be sitting at the very back of the theater. A lot of these shows work just fine. In fact, I often would prefer to sit not in the orchestra section. I like the mezzanine.
How do you do it?
How do I get those?
Yeah, if you can tell.
Well, there's an article, a permanent article in the Times in our theater section about various ways you can get cheaper tickets. So I recommend people have a look there. But there's the TDF booth, there's, the TKTS booth, there's Theater Development Fund, which offers, lots of discounts, particularly on shows and previews, which is a great time to see things anyway. Form your own opinion before the press mauls it. And then there's just looking around. When we have this, it's not really called congestion pricing, but when we have this sort of pricing scheme that super values certain seats, then other seats will be undervalued, and you look for those.
What can be done to get theater more attractive to younger people and to minorities? That you find very few of either in many theater performances.
Well, I think it's in terms of people who are traditionally have, been sort of left out of the subject matter of Broadway theater especially, I think we're doing better. And by we, I certainly don't mean me, come to think of it. I mean the artists and the gatekeepers. There's been a lot more plays that address minority experience, just as there always has been, but just different minorities. I mean, I recently wrote a piece about Jewish theater,
right.
And there was a time when that was the kind of outre or new thing to be seen. Irish theater before that, and now I'm happy to say a good 30 to 40% of what I see is not just telling me the same old stories that I grew up enjoying about people a lot like myself. I'm learning about many other kinds of people. So that, in terms of content, there's a strong push to improve that, a lot more distance to go. But making the connection between the content and the audience is not straightforward. For one thing, you have to do it for years. You can't expect to just put like one play out there or two or even a few in one season and think, oh, that'll get everybody coming. It just doesn't happen that way. But also coming out of the pandemic, people's viewing habits, entertainment habits have changed quite a lot, and it's harder to get people to come out for the night and go to a show and pay a lot of money, and certainly young people are not doing it as much. So you either have to find content that is much more attractive or you have to alter the pricing scheme. I don't see much hope of the latter happening. With
the holidays coming up, this season winding down somewhat, what is a typical season like for you as a reviewer? It must be kind of grueling.
There are moments when it's grueling, and not just because of the content. There's parts of the season. The season is understood in the theater world here in New York to run from the beginning of, I think it's officially the beginning of May to the end of April. And the worst month is April, because as in movies, everybody wants to open closest to the deadline for the awards in hopes of getting awards. So in April, we're going to be seeing this year on Broadway, let alone off Broadway, at least 11 new shows, possibly as many as 14. That's grueling, and I actually can't cover
So that's 3 or 4 or so a week.
Yeah, it's not just seeing them, though. You have to write about them, and write about them with some insight and sensitivity, or at least you try, and that's very difficult. And November is often a month that is similar because a lot of producers want to get their shows open for the holidays, so they open in November. On the other hand, January and mostly February are kind of empty. That's nice. Gives some room for off-Broadway shows to open and get a little air, and I really am a big supporter of off-Broadway and regional theater, so that's nice for me. I get to go around and look.
Is it better to write a review on deadline when you get that gut reaction to it, or to think about it some more? I don't want to make it worse for you.
I can't. If I talk about this, my editors will learn the awful secret, which is it's actually better when you are writing on a bad deadline.
Yeah, I would think so in a way, because it's more visceral, isn't it?
Well, you can't really censor yourself. You don't have time to get caught up in your neurotic whirls and you're like, what is my perfect sentence? You just put down the sentence that will do, and often that is the perfect sentence. So I don't like to admit that, but when I only have overnight to write a review, which happens sometimes, I can't really see the difference in quality.
Now, when a reader says, should I go to that play or not? I'm reading the review. Why should I decide on the basis of someone else's opinion? And that goes for any review.
Yeah, well, and I do get a lot of people asking me what they should go to, and it's very hard to answer that. And also a lot of people saying, how could you tell me to go to that show? Or why didn't you like this show that I loved? Clearly, they always say, you saw a different performance than I did. But no, we all have different taste. What I think a critic can do in whatever field is provide a kind of steady aesthetic by which readers who learn that critic can judge where they stand. So they know, well, he always likes that fancy stuff. I don't ever like that. So he likes that. I'm not going to like it. I won't go to that. This is, or the other way around. I actually don't want to agree with the critics I read most passionately. I want to hear them challenge what I think I don't like or do like, explain why, and then still do what I want to do. I certainly grew up reading critics I really in no way agreed with aesthetically and certainly not politically, but that wasn't the point. The point was to kind of test yourself up against a very clear consciousness, and that's what I try to provide.
What are some of the plays you like best this season?
Well, it was really a wildly, and my best of list, that we all do our best of 2023 list, is actually part of last season and part of this season because it's a calendar year. But as it happened, a lot of stuff happened at the end of the year that was really thrilling, and I found it such an unusual thing. Even on Broadway, there was an enormous range. Like we had an Ibsen revival, an Ibsen revival of A Doll's House that was about the chicest play on Broadway.
You said it aged very well.
Yeah, well, it was a beautiful adaptation in modern language by Amy Herzog, and it was a beautiful production starring Jessica Chastain that, you know, made it seem like this was happening to someone you knew at work, like someone you knew at work was having this problem at home. It was really astonishing that way. On the other hand, you know, we went all the way to, near the end of the year, a show kind of based on the band Fleetwood Mac. I mean, it's quite a range there. This was a play called Stereophonic by David Adjemi, which is about the making of a classic rock album, and with songs by Will Butler, and it was an engrossing and beautiful, it's still playing, beautiful production, really funny, and really kind of underneath that about something very deep. I have hopes it might transfer to Broadway, but that's always, you know, a risk, so I don't know whether it'll happen.
And Love, you said appropriately enough, in the Armory.
Yes, so that was a show at the beginning of the year. Most of the shows on my list are not commercial productions. They're off-Broadway or institutional theater productions or imports, and that was imported from England. And it was about a homeless shelter, the residents of it, and the way it was staged, many members of the audience were sort of part of the population of the homeless shelter. And it really was both moving and funny, but also a challenge to us in the theater to think about why we are able to look at this material in a dramatic presentation, then walk out onto the street on Park Avenue, see the very same thing, and not respond to it. Mm-hmm. I don't have an answer for that, but it was a wonderful use of theater in the moment.
Mm-hmm. A couple of others you mentioned, How to Defend Yourself.
Well, this was an extremely timely and yet new kind of show. I'm surprised it hasn't been dealt with before. This is about a women's self-help, women's self-defense class at a college after a young woman, a sorority sister of some of the organizers of this group, has been raped. And so they get together. They really don't know what they're doing, but they want to teach a class to help women, you know, protect themselves from this sort of thing, and two boys, too, who are allies. And what they discover, among other things, is that they really cannot sort out the questions of control and permission that are at the bottom of the, you know, campus confusion currently about what is consensual, what is not consensual, what is consent. And then this play takes an unbelievable turn at the end that I found very powerfully moving. I didn't want to give it away, but one of my colleagues, attached to my list is a wonderful selection of great moments of the year, and one of my colleagues gives the whole thing away, so that's good.
All right, we won't give it away.
No,
no spoiler alert. Pearly Victorious coming back for the first time, you mentioned, right?
Yes, this was the first revival of a play by Ossie Davis from, I think, the early 60s, in which he deliberately, talk about dramedy, he set out to use his fury over the condition of black people in the United States over the decades, but even then, and the failures and limitations of white allyship in the civil rights movement, and made an absolutely rollicking comedy out of it. It's running into February, I believe, and it's about a sort of fake preacher who. There's a scheme, there's money, there's somebody pretending to be someone she's not. It's very much a farce about something really powerful, and it's beautifully acted. It stars Leslie Odom Jr. as Pearly himself. It was made into a musical at some point, so that we've seen in New York. But the original play, go figure, never redone until now. I predict you'll be seeing it all over the country in the coming year or two.
Jesse, speaking of predictions, very quickly, what should we look forward to in the coming year?
Well, I made a list, Sam.
Oh, you just happen to have a list, okay.
I don't know. You know, it's hard for me to, as a critic, I really shouldn't be saying what I think is going to be great.
But things you are looking forward to seeing.
Yeah, well, so a lot of what I'm looking forward to seeing is off-Broadway, because I figure also the Broadway stuff can fend for itself. So there's a new play by the great playwright Susan Laurie Parks called Sally and Tom, and if you think for a moment about those names, you might be able to figure out that it's about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. And I'm just basically dying to see how she treats that subject. You know, at the other end of the spectrum, at the new Performing Arts Center at the World Trade Center site, yes, they're doing a version of Cats, but set in the Harlem Ball scene. It's called Cats, the Jellicoe Ball, and you know, I just have no idea what that's going to be, and I love it when I have no idea what that's going to be.
Okay, looking forward to that. Jesse Green, Chief Theater Critic of the New York Times, thanks for joining us. Coming up next, Crowdsourcing, Unsolved Crimes. True crime storytelling is not new. Some even consider the Bible the first true crime book. But in 2014, radio show This America Life's serial podcast helped bring the genre into the digital age. It whet the appetites of listeners worldwide to solve actual crimes. In this week's New York Times Magazine, Sarah Viren writes about the downsides of crowdsourcing crime and its effect on families and communities. Sarah, how did you get involved with Liz Flatt, and tell us what her story is really about?
Yeah, so I first heard about the story of Liz's sister, who was murdered, Deborah Sue Williamson, when I lived in Lubbock. She's from Lubbock. And I heard about her murder and started paying attention to it and reached out to Liz and talked to Liz. And
this murder was years ago, right?
So her sister, Deborah Sue Williamson, was murdered in 1975. She was 18 and newlywed. And Liz, who the story really focuses on, her sister was 8 at the time. She was an 8-year-old girl. And it was a sort of devastating moment in her life in which she lost her big sister. And the story itself, there was lots of attempts to solve it, but nothing, the killer was never found. And so Liz in her 40s in 2016, decided that she was going to try to push the police to solve it and investigate it herself. And so I began talking to her in 2017 about that. And then I followed her story as she met some investigators who also began investigating it. And the story itself that I tell is about that. But it's interesting, that time period in which I started paying attention to Deborah Sue Williamson's murder and Liz got involved is also the time period that you mentioned, which is when we see this really big shift in the world of true crime that academics sometimes call the serial effect. So, since Serial came out, there's been this explosion in podcasts, all these new conferences, but also this world of what people call sort of crowdsourcing, or online communities dedicated to true crime. And so the story is really about that.
Sarah, how do you crowdsource a crime or crowdsource solving a crime?
Well, crowdsourcing is this term that's been around since like 2008. And the idea is to outsource an investigation or a question to the crowd, right? And the crowd being the general public. But usually the idea is that in the general public, there are experts among us that might be able to help. And so the idea of crowdsourcing a crime would be that the police don't have the resources to look at these cold cases. A lot of them are focusing on current murders, not on these sort of older cases that seem harder to solve. And so the idea is like, if we just have a bunch of people poring over the evidence, maybe they'll come up with something. That's the sort of theory behind it. In this particular case, we had 2 investigators who were doing investigative work, and then they would put all the information in podcasts on the Facebook page that they started for Deborah Sue Williamson, and also in articles online. And then they would ask the general public to weigh in. Hey, did you know, where did Debbie live when she was there? Did you happen to know, somebody knew her, then she worked at McDonald's? And so the idea is that maybe people would come forth with information that could be helpful in solving the crime.
Crime this old, don't you get a lot of cranks calling in or writing in or going online? And how much progress did they make since then in actually solving it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the conundrum of this sort of model of community-based solving a crime. I mean, this idea that the general public has stakes in a murder being solved, therefore should be involved in a murder being solved. The problem is that the general public includes some experts, but also includes a lot of cranks. And so, yeah, so, something that was really interesting to me was that when Deborah Sue Williamson died, when she was murdered in 1975, her murder was a big deal in Lubbock. They wrote a story. The editor of the local newspaper said he wanted to write a story about her murder every day until it was solved. And so for 3 months, there was a story about her every day in the newspaper. And her family received a lot of crank calls. At that point, we didn't have social media, we didn't have online communities, but the community was obsessed. And they received all these crank calls of people, either harassing them or saying they had ideas about how it should be solved. And what we see now in these sort of Facebook communities is something the same, people coming up with ideas about how they think should be solved. But what happened in this particular story is that there was a breakdown in the relationship between Liz Flatt, who I write about, the sister, and these two investigator podcasters who were working with her. They had a fight, basically. And so they stopped talking. And that fight became the center of the sort of discussion on this Facebook community. And so instead of necessarily talking about Deborah Sue Williamson and her murder, which they do talk about, they also started to talk about Liz Flatt and what an awful person she was for breaking, with these two investigators. So you see that the real conflict or possibility for conflict within this particular story.
So when somebody wants to crowdsource a murder or investigation, what is the impact on the victim or the victim's family or friends? In a case like this, Liz Flatt in particular.
I mean, something that people talk about a lot is the idea of re-traumatizing the family, and I think that doesn't just happen with crowdsourcing. I think that happens with our obsession with true crime, that particularly these types of crimes. I mean, Debbie Sue Williamson was young, blonde, newly married. There's a particular type of victim that these true crime crowds are attracted to. And what happens is that murder is replayed again and again and again. So that idea of re-traumatizing is something that's brought up a lot. I think what's different in this case, but that we do see some, in the story I read about, I have two sisters who have had this experience where they suddenly become part of the story. So it's not just that they're being re-traumatized by watching, the murder of their family member be investigated and all those sort of gory details be replayed. It's also that they get brought into the drama and they become sort of a target. And so in this case, what happened to Liz is that she did become a bit of a target, or has become a bit of a target for that crowd. And that's traumatizing in a completely different way, right? Because not only is she dealing with the tragedy of her sister, but now she's also being attacked for not handling it correctly, according to this crowd.
This obviously puts pressure on the police to do something. This investigation went so far as to have the body exhumed. Will this case ever be solved?
I don't think it will be solved. I think there's I write, the story ends with the exhumation of Debbie Sue's body, and it's sort of the last chance to try to find some DNA evidence, because any of these old cases that are solved, they're almost always solved because of new DNA technology that's able to find some sort of link between the killer and the person who was killed. So that's what they're looking for with the exhumation. There was a forensic anthropologist there when I was there who told me there's just a really slim chance they'll be able to find something in a corpse, a 50-year-old corpse. But I think that for Liz, her goal was always, we need to try everything we can, right? And so that's the hope. But I think the thing that as a public we have to think about is that so many of these cases are just not going to be solved, and we want them to be solved. You know, the reason true crime stories are so popular, that they're as old as time, that they date back to the, you know, the Bible, is that they're satisfying. There's a sort of narrative arc to a story like that that is satisfying when we have resolution. But so often in reality, we don't have resolution. And so in this case, I hope for Liz and for everyone else's sake, but I think there's a real slim chance that it'll be solved.
Sarah Viren from the New York Times Magazine, thanks so much for joining us. And coming up next, I'll share some timely holiday thoughts on being fat. Score another benchmark in the battle against discrimination. While the public and the press were focused, with good reason, on the insidious rise in anti-Semitic and anti-Islamic incidents, the City Council extended protection against discrimination to an entire new category of New Yorkers. Until now, the government was largely concerned with safeguarding the public's rights on the basis of who they are and of how they identify themselves. Race and ethnicity aside, of course, most forms of discrimination based on personal appearance, Human Rights Commissioner Annabelle Palma said, have gone unchecked. So just as we were gorging on turkey, stuffing, and pumpkin pie late last month, Intro 209A took effect. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of a person's height or weight in employment, housing, and public accommodations. The legislation isn't brass-bound, which would, of course, create ludicrous and painful challenges, especially in certain occupations. Just use your imagination. The law allows for exemptions, generally if a person's height or weight reasonably prevents them from performing the normal and essential requirements of a job. The law was sponsored by Council member Sean Abreu. He is of average height and weight, although he gained a few pounds during the pandemic, and some of his expertise on this issue may have come from his mother, who happens to work at Zabar's. Size discrimination is a social justice issue and a public health threat, he said. Millions are taught to hate their bodies. As the global beacon of tolerance, he said, it's only right that New York City is leading the national effort to end size discrimination. That effort may even have begun here. Back in 1967, about 500 New Yorkers gathered in Central Park for a fat-in to protest discrimination on the basis of body size. The bill was signed by Mayor Adams. He once wrote a book about losing 35 pounds on a plant-based diet. The legislation may seem futile, even frivolous, another case of Big Brother overreaching, but not if you've been turned down for a job or faced other discrimination because of something beyond your control. We're reminded every day that it's tough enough to teach tolerance. The least we can do is make discrimination illegal. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.